There is a widely accepted explanation for how the American frontier was settled. Pioneers moved west. They built towns. They established communities. They created infrastructure as populations grew, and as populations grew, they buried their dead. That is the standard sequence. Settlement first, cemeteries second. Except when you look at the records, the actual county records, the land survey documents, the cemetery registry filings from the mid-1800s across the continental United States, the sequence does not always hold. In dozens of documented cases, the cemetery came first. Not by a few years. Not by a generation. In some instances by several decades. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Let's begin with what we know with confidence. The expansion of European origin settlements across North America followed a broadly documented arc. The eastern seaboard was colonized through the 1600s and 1700s. The interior followed, the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, the Mississippi Corridor, through the late 1700s and into the early 1800s. The Great Plains and Far West opened primarily after the 1840s, accelerated by the Homestead Act of 1862, the Transcontinental Railroad, and the systematic surveying conducted by the General Land Office. This is not contested history. The records are extensive. The census data is clear. And yet, embedded within those same records, are anomalies that have attracted the attention of amateur historians, genealogists, and local archivists for well over a century. The anomaly is this: cemetery registries, land deed filings, and county plat maps from across the interior of North America sometimes document established burial grounds in areas where, according to the same official settlement timelines, there was no established population to generate them. Not one cemetery. Not one county. Across multiple states, multiple regions, multiple independent record systems. The scale of the mismatch is what makes it uncomfortable. Consider the standard model for how a rural American cemetery forms. A family settles land. Someone dies, a child, an elder, a neighbor. A small plot of land is set aside. The burial is recorded, sometimes informally. Over years, as the community grows, the burial ground expands. Eventually, it is formally registered with county authorities, deeded, named, and mapped. This is how it is supposed to work. And this is how it does work, in most cases. But regional archivists and genealogical researchers working in states like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, and across parts of the upper Midwest have noted a recurring irregularity in cemetery deed records. Formal deed filings for burial grounds that predate the first documented homestead claim in the surrounding area, sometimes by 10 years, sometimes by 30. What is not a simple record error is the consistency of the pattern. Individual errors occur. But patterns across unconnected counties, across unconnected states, across unconnected record-keeping systems, raise a different kind of question. The question is not, was there a mistake? The question becomes, what was already there? There is a conventional explanation offered for some of these discrepancies. Early settlers, the argument goes, often informally buried the dead before any formal land claims were filed. Record-keeping on the frontier was inconsistent. Deed filing sometimes lagged behind actual use by years or decades. Therefore, what appears to be a cemetery predating settlement may simply be a cemetery whose paperwork was delayed. This is a reasonable explanation. It accounts for a portion of the discrepancies, but it does not account for all of them, because some of the burial grounds in question are not small informal plots. Some are large. Some show evidence of organized layout, rows, sections, planned spatial arrangement, that implies not a family burying its dead informally but a system, a planned system, in a location where, according to official records, no planning community yet existed. The scale problem deepens when you move beyond the United States. In parts of Canada, particularly the prairie provinces settled in earnest only in the late 1800s, similar anomalies appear in provincial land records. Cemetery registrations that precede township formation. Burial grounds that appear on early survey maps with no corresponding settler population recorded in the same survey. Survey teams conducting the Dominion Land Survey in the 1870s and 1880s, the massive grid mapping project that established the township range system across western Canada, occasionally noted existing structures, cleared land, and in some cases, burial grounds in areas officially classified as unsettled wilderness. The surveyors noted these things. They recorded them. The records exist. What the records do not contain is an explanation for what those burial grounds were doing there. One interpretation frequently offered is that these sites belong to indigenous populations, and that later settlers, unfamiliar with or indifferent to that history, simply built near them, over them, or incorporated them into the expanding settlement grid without accurate attribution. This is a documented phenomenon. It is real. It explains some of what is observed. But researchers examining the physical layout of certain burial grounds have noted features, spacing, orientation, material evidence, that do not align cleanly with the documented burial practices of the indigenous nations known to have inhabited those specific regions. That does not mean those burial grounds did not belong to indigenous communities. It means the record is incomplete. It means the attribution is uncertain. And uncertainty at this scale and this consistency is its own kind of data. What you are left with is this. Across a wide geographic band, stretching from the eastern Midwest through the Great Plains and into the Canadian prairies, there exists a recurring pattern of burial infrastructure appearing in advance of the documented populations that should have created it. The cemeteries are there. The settlements arrived later. In some cases, much later. This is not a fringe claim. This is drawn from county deed offices, provincial land registries, Dominion Survey field notes, and General Land Office records. These are not alternative sources. These are the official sources. And the official sources raise a question that the official history has not fully resolved. What were those burial grounds for? And more precisely, who made them? The pattern established in the Midwest and Canadian prairies does not exist in isolation. That is the part that resists easy dismissal. If this were a regional quirk, a product of chaotic frontier record-keeping in one specific area, during one specific period, it could be set aside as administrative noise. Frontier documentation was imperfect. Everyone acknowledges this. But the moment you begin pulling equivalent records from geographically distant regions, the administrative noise argument becomes harder to sustain. Because the pattern repeats, not approximately, not loosely, with a structural consistency that crosses oceans. Begin with the United Kingdom. England, Scotland, and Wales maintain some of the most rigorously preserved historical land and parish records in the world. The tithe maps of the 1830s and 1840s, the enclosure awards, the Ordnance Survey records beginning in earnest in the early 1800s. These constitute a layered documentary archive that allows researchers to trace land use, population distribution, and infrastructure development with considerable precision. And within that archive, a similar pattern emerges. Churchyards and burial grounds documented in parish records for small rural settlements, particularly in the Midlands, the Welsh borders, and parts of northern England, that show anomalous scale relative to the population they were nominally serving. A burial ground designed, by its spatial layout and total capacity, for a community of several hundred. Documented in parishes where 18th century census equivalents, the hearth tax records, the ecclesiastical surveys, suggest populations of 40, 50, sometimes fewer. The standard explanation is that these grounds were built with future growth in mind. That communities planned ahead. That the church, in particular, established infrastructure in advance of need as a matter of institutional practice. This explanation is plausible. The church did build ambitiously. English ecclesiastical architecture consistently outpaced immediate population requirements. But ambition alone does not account for every instance. And it does not account for cases where the burial ground not only exceeds the contemporary population, but precedes any documented continuous habitation on that specific site at all. There are villages in England, particularly in the post-Black Death landscape, where settlement histories are genuinely complex. Populations were decimated. Villages were abandoned. New settlements rose sometimes on or near older sites, sometimes at a distance. Historians call them lost villages. The phenomenon is real and well documented. What is less frequently examined is the inverse situation: burial grounds and churchyards that persist, that are present, registered, maintained, in locations where the settlement history does not clearly explain their origin. Not abandoned sites. Active ones. Sites that were incorporated into later settlement patterns as though they had simply always been there. Because, according to the available record, they had. Now move to the United States more specifically, because the American examples carry a particular intensity. The General Land Office Survey System, initiated formally in 1785 and expanded aggressively through the 19th century, created one of the most systematic land documentation projects in modern history. Township plats, section maps, surveyor field notes. These were produced with methodical regularity as the survey teams moved westward ahead of official settlement. The field notes are especially revealing, because surveyors were instructed to record not just the geometry of the land, but its condition, timber types, water sources, soil character, and, critically, existing human modification. In those field notes, across surveys conducted in territories officially classified as wilderness, surveyors recorded clearings, roadbeds, structural remnants, and on multiple documented occasions, burial grounds. These observations were made before the first land patents in those areas were issued, before the first homestead claims were filed, before, according to the official settlement record, anyone was supposed to be there. The surveyors did not speculate about what they were looking at. They recorded what they saw and moved on. That was their job. But the observations are in the record. They have always been in the record. What makes the American examples particularly resistant to simple explanation is the infrastructure dimension. Cemeteries are not passive features of a landscape. They require decisions. They require cleared land. They require at minimum a consistent social agreement about where the dead go, which implies a community with enough organizational coherence to make and enforce that agreement. A formal burial ground with organized rows and delineated sections implies more than grief. It implies planning. It implies permanence. It implies a community that expected to be somewhere long enough to bury multiple generations. This is the mismatch that the delayed record-keeping explanation struggles to fully absorb, because delayed record-keeping explains paperwork arriving late. It does not explain infrastructure built for a future that, according to official timelines, had not yet been decided upon. Expand further. Into the southern United States, Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, where land survey records from the late 1700s show analogous patterns. Burial grounds appearing in areas listed as frontier in the same documents. Scale inconsistencies recurring in state-level cemetery registration records that were compiled and cross-referenced in the early 20th century by genealogical societies, not to raise questions but simply to preserve family histories. The questions emerged from the preservation effort itself. Researchers following family lines backward found their trails ending not at a first settler and an empty land, but at a cemetery that was already there, already organized, already in use, apparently waiting. Across the Atlantic again, and now into Central Europe, where German, Austrian, and Czech regional archives contain land records showing similar anomalies in the settlement histories of frontier regions pushed eastward during the medieval and early modern periods. The pattern is not confined to the English-speaking world. It is not a product of one record-keeping tradition. It appears across multiple languages, multiple administrative systems, multiple centuries of documentation. At a certain point, the geographic spread of a pattern stops being a complication and starts being the most important fact about it. Some researchers, working primarily outside academic institutions, in genealogical societies, local historical associations, and independent archival projects, have begun grouping these observations under a broader interpretive framework. They are not all saying the same thing. They do not agree on causes, on timelines, or on what the patterns ultimately mean. But a label has emerged in some of these discussions. A word that functions less as a conclusion and more as a container for a set of unresolved observations. That label has a name. And before it can be examined honestly, it is worth understanding exactly what it is and what it is not. The word is Tartaria. It appears in these discussions with increasing frequency. In online forums dedicated to historical anomalies. In independent research threads maintained by amateur archivists. In commentary attached to digitized survey records and cemetery deed databases that have become publicly accessible over the past 2 decades. And the moment the word appears, something happens to the conversation. It either accelerates into speculation, or it stops entirely. Neither response is particularly useful. Because before Tartaria becomes a conclusion, it is worth examining what it actually is historically, and why it has become the label that certain researchers reach for when conventional frameworks feel insufficient. Tartaria, or Tartary as it appears in older European cartographic tradition, is a real historical term. It is not invented. It is not fringe in its origins. For several centuries, from roughly the 1500s through the early 1800s, European maps used the term Great Tartary, or Tartaria, to describe a vast, loosely defined geographic region spanning much of Central Asia, Siberia, and extending in some cartographic traditions into areas that would later become part of the Russian Empire. The term appears in major European atlases, including those produced by Ortelius, Mercator, and later the French cartographic tradition through figures like Guillaume de Lisle. It was not a political designation in the modern sense. It did not consistently refer to a unified state or empire. It was a geographic and ethnographic label. Imprecise, European in perspective, applied to territories that were genuinely vast and genuinely difficult for Western cartographers to document with accuracy. The term faded from cartographic use as Russian imperial expansion brought more systematic documentation to those regions. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria had largely disappeared from maps, replaced by the specific political and geographic designations that persist today. This is the documented history of the term. It is not hidden. It is available in any serious cartographic history. So why does this word appear in discussions about pre-settlement cemeteries in Illinois? In anomalous burial grounds in rural England? In surveyor field notes from the Ohio Valley? The connection is not geographic. It is interpretive. Some researchers, and it is important to be precise about who is making this move, have used Tartaria as a shorthand for a broader proposition, that the historical record of North America and parts of Europe contains evidence of a prior civilization, or prior civilizations, whose physical traces are occasionally visible in the landscape but whose existence is not accounted for in mainstream historical chronology. The cemeteries in this interpretive framework are evidence. Infrastructure without a documented population. Burial grounds without a documented origin. Settlements that arrived, in some cases, to find the ground already prepared. This is one interpretation. It should be stated clearly, it is not a peer-reviewed conclusion. It is not supported by the institutional consensus of academic archaeology or history. Most historians who have encountered these arguments have found them unconvincing, or have offered conventional explanations, record delays, indigenous misattribution, survey inaccuracy, that they consider adequate. But there are other interpretations, and they deserve equal space. A second interpretation holds that what the record reflects is not a prior civilization but a prior complexity, that early settlement of North America and parts of Europe was more layered, more contested, and more poorly documented than the clean narratives that emerged from 19th-century nation-building historiography. On this reading, the cemeteries belong to real, documented populations. Indigenous communities, early colonial expeditions, failed settlements, temporary encampments, whose histories were inadequately preserved because the record-keeping priorities of the era did not consider those populations worth full documentation. This interpretation does not require a hidden civilization. It requires only an acknowledgement that the historical record was produced by specific people with specific interests, and that what those people chose to record and what they chose not to record shaped what we now treat as established fact. This is not a controversial claim. It is the foundation of modern historical methodology. A third interpretation is more technical. It suggests that the apparent anomalies, the cemeteries preceding settlements, the infrastructure without populations, are largely products of record fragmentation. That the full picture, if all surviving documents could be integrated, would resolve most of these discrepancies into legible conventional history. This interpretation is also reasonable. Archival gaps are real. Cross-referencing incomplete records from different administrative systems inevitably produces apparent inconsistencies that may not be real inconsistencies at all. The difficulty with this interpretation is that it is, by definition, unfalsifiable in the present. We cannot know what the complete record would show. We only have what survived. And what survived raises questions. What is notable about the Tartaria label, setting aside its more dramatic applications, is that it has functioned for a loosely connected network of independent researchers, as a way of making a question speakable. There is something in the landscape that does not fit cleanly. The burial grounds exist. The dates exist. The surveyor notes exist. The deed filings exist. The mismatch between what those records show and what the settlement timeline predicts is real, documented, and recurring. Calling that mismatch Tartaria does not explain it, but it names it, and naming a pattern, even imprecisely, is sometimes the first step toward examining it with more rigor. The risk, of course, is that the name becomes the explanation, that the label closes the question rather than opening it, that researchers stop asking what is this and start asserting we know what this is, and in doing so, move from observation to conclusion without the evidence to justify the leap. That risk is visible in how some corners of this discussion have developed. The interpretive framework has, in certain spaces, hardened into certainty. And certainty, without the evidentiary foundation to support it, is where genuine inquiry ends. What remains, stripped of both institutional dismissal and speculative overclaim, is a set of observations that have not been fully resolved. Burial grounds that predate their documented communities. Infrastructure that implies planning for populations that, by the official record, did not yet exist. Patterns that repeat across regions, across record systems, across centuries of documentation. The official history has explanations. Some of those explanations are convincing. Some are partial. Some leave a remainder, a portion of the pattern that the explanation does not quite reach. It is in that remainder where the question lives. Not in the answer that Tartaria proposes. Not in the dismissal that mainstream historiography sometimes offers. But in the space between them, where the records sit, patient and unresolved, waiting for a framework precise enough to hold them. The cemeteries were there before the towns. In some cases long before. And the question of who made them and why they were already waiting when the settlers arrived, that question has not been answered. It has only been named.